this was Rabin's expression. He never thought this will end in a full-fledged Palestinian state. There was a lot of ambiguity, constructive ambiguity, might Kissinger say, but I think it was destructive ambiguity. It helped, this destructive ambiguity helped in clinching the Oslo agreement, but it was a minefield for those who went to Camp David and later on to Taba to try and solve all the pending issues.
Professor Norman Finkelstein.
Well, I'm going to try to focus on the key points. There are issues about the refugees in Jerusalem, which for now I can't get into, but I would be happy to return to them later when we discuss what was the impasse at the impasse at Camp David and Taba. But I want to set the context, and I agree in part with the context that Dr. Ben Ami set out, but not fully. The main context, in my opinion, is as follows. Since the mid-1970s, there's been an international consensus for resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict. Most of your listeners will be familiar with it. It's called the two-state settlement. And the two-state settlement is pretty straightforward, uncomplicated. Israel has to fully withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem in accordance with the fundamental principle of international law, cited 3 times by Mr. Ben Ami in his book, that it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. The West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem having been acquired by war, it's inadmissible for Israel to keep them. They have to be returned. On the Palestinian side, and also the side of the neighboring Arab states, they have to recognize Israel's right to live in peace and security with its neighbors. That was the quid pro quo. Recognition of Israel, Palestinian right to self-determination in the West Bank and Gaza with its capital in Jerusalem. That's the international consensus. It's not complicated. It's also not controversial. You see it voted on every year in the United Nations. The vote's typically something like 160 nations on one side, the United States, Israel, and Nauru, Palau, Tuvalu, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands on the other side. That's it. Now, the Israeli government was fully aware that this was the international consensus, but they were opposed, A, to a full withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza, and Jerusalem, of course, and 2, they were opposed to creating a Palestinian state in the occupied territories. Come 1981, as pressure builds on Israel to reach a diplomatic settlement in the Israel-Palestine conflict, they decide to invade Lebanon in order to crush the PLO because the PLO was on record supporting a two-state settlement. As Dr. Ben Ami's colleague, Avner Yaniv, put it in a very excellent book, Dilemmas of Security, he said the main problem for Israel was, and now I'm quoting him, the PLO's peace offensive. They wanted a two-state settlement. Israel did not, and so Israel decides to crush the PLO in Lebanon. It successfully did so. The PLO goes into exile. Come 1987, Palestinians in the occupied territories despair of any possibility of international intervention, and they enter into a revolt, the Palestinian Intifada, basically nonviolent civilian revolt by the Palestinians. And the revolt proves to be remarkably successful for maybe the first couple of years. Come 1990, Iraq invades Kuwait. The PLO supports, ambiguously, but I think we fairly can say, and I agree with Dr. Ben Ami on this, they lend support to Iraq. The war ends, Iraq defeated, and all the Gulf states cut off all of their money to the PLO. The PLO is going down the tubes. Along comes Israel with a clever idea. Mr. Rabin says, let's throw Arafat a life preserver, but on condition. And Dr. Ben Ami puts it excellently, that the PLO will be Israel's subcontractor and collaborator in the occupied territories, and now I'm quoting Dr. Ben Ami, in order to suppress the genuinely democratic tendencies of the Palestinians. Now, it's true, exactly as Dr. Ben Ami said, that Israel had 2 options after the Iraq War. It could have negotiated with the real representatives of the Palestinians who wanted that full two-state settlement in accordance with the international consensus, or it can negotiate with Arafat in the hope that he's so desperate that he's going to serve as their collaborator and subcontractor in order to deny the Palestinians what they're entitled to under international law. The Israelis chose Arafat, not only because Arafat himself was desperate, they chose him because they thought he would deny them what they were entitled to. He would suppress all resistance to the occupation.
Professor Norman Finkelstein, author of Beyond Chutzpah, more from his debate with former Israeli Foreign Minister Shlomo Ben Ami after the break. Latif Al-Idrisi here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue today with the debate between Professor Norman Finkelstein and former Israeli Foreign Minister Shlomo Ben Ami, since the outbreak of the latest Palestinian Intifada in the fall of 2000, the subject of what happened during the final round of peace talks at Camp David in July 2000 and at Taba in January 2001 has been the subject of much debate. The Israeli government and its supporters have blamed the Palestinians for rejecting what they say was a generous offer that would have given them a viable state. The Palestinians say Israel never made an offer that even approaches meeting their minimal rights. Each side has used the other's alleged position to assign blame for the violence that's plunged the conflict into deeper chaos. We begin this part of the debate with Professor Norman Finkelstein talking about the peace talks at Camp David in July 2000.
My concern is, let's look at the diplomatic record, the factual record. What were the offers being made on each side at the Camp David and in the Taba talks? And the standard interpretation, which is, you can call it the Dennis Ross interpretation, which I think, unfortunately, Dr. Ben Ami echoes, is that Israel made huge concessions at Camp David and Camp David and Taba. Palestinians refused to make any concessions because of what Dr. Ben Ami repeatedly calls Arafat's unyielding positions, and that Arafat missed a huge opportunity. Now, it is correct to say that if you frame everything in terms of what Israel wanted, it made huge concessions. However, if you frame things in terms of what Israel was legally entitled to under international law, then Israel made precisely and exactly 0 concessions. All the concessions were made by the Palestinians. Briefly, because we don't have time, there were 4 key issues at Camp David and at Taba. Number 1, settlements. Number 2, borders. Number 3, Jerusalem. Number 4, refugees. Let's start with settlements. Under international law, there is no dispute, no controversy. Under Article 49 of the 4th Geneva Convention, it's illegal for any occupying country to transfer its population to occupied territories. All of the settlements are illegal under international law. No dispute. The World Court in July 2004 ruled that all the settlements are illegal. The Palestinians were willing to concede 50% of the Israeli settlements in the West Bank. That was a monumental concession. going well beyond anything that was demanded of them under international law. Borders. The principle is clear. I don't want to get into it now because I was very glad to see that Dr. Ben Ami quoted it 3 times in his book. It's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Under international law, Israel had to withdraw from all of the West Bank and all of Gaza. As the World Court put it in July 2004, those are, quote, occupied Palestinian territories. Now, however you want to argue over percentages, there is no question, and I know Dr. Ben Ami won't dispute it, the Palestinians were willing to make concessions on the borders. What percentage? There's differences. But there's no question they were willing to make concessions. Jerusalem. Jerusalem's an interesting case, because if you read Dr. Ben Ami or the standard mainstream accounts in the United States, everyone talks about the huge concessions that Barak was willing to make on Jerusalem. But under international law, Israel has not one atom of sovereignty over any of Jerusalem. Read the World Court decision. The World Court decision said Jerusalem is occupied Palestinian territory. Now, the Palestinians were willing, the exact lines I'm not going to get into now. They are complicated. But I'm sure Dr. Ben Ami will not dispute they were willing to divide Jerusalem roughly in half, the Jewish side to Israel, the Arab side to the Palestinians. And number 4, refugees. On the question of refugees, it's not a dispute under international law. Remarkably, even fairly conservative human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, in 2000 during the Camp David talks, they issued statements on the question of the right of return. And they stated categorically, under international law, every Palestinian, roughly 5 to 6 million, has the right to return not to some little parcels, 1% of Israel, which Israel is about, Israel would swap, return to their homes or the environs of their homes in Israel. That's the law. Now, Dr. Ben Ami will surely agree that the Palestinians were not demanding and never demanded the full return of 6 million refugees. He gives a figure of 400,000 to 800,000. In fact, I'm not going to get into the numbers because it's very hard to pin it down. Other authors have given figures of the tens of thousands to 200,000 refugees returning. That's well short of 6 million. On every single issue, all the concessions came from the Palestinians. The problem is everyone, including Dr. Ben Ami in his book, he begins with what Israel wants and how much of it wants it's willing to give up. But that's not the relevant framework. The only relevant framework is, under international law, what you're entitled to. And when you use that framework, it's a very, very different picture.
If you can bear to make this response brief,
yes.
Dr. Shlomo Ben Ami.
Okay. In the last third part of the book, as Dr. Finkelstein says, there is the diplomat. And this same diplomat still behaves in a way as a historian when he says in this book that Camp David was not the missed opportunity for the Palestinians, and if I were a Palestinian, I would have rejected Camp David as well. This is something I put in the book. But Taba is the problem. The Clinton parameters are the problem. Because the Clinton parameters, in my view...
Maybe you can explain them what that is. I don't think most people will know the Clinton parameters. So
well, the Clinton parameters say the following. They say that on the territorial issue, the Palestinians will get 100% of Gaza, 97% of the West Bank, plus a safe passage from Gaza to the West Bank to make the state viable. There will be a land swap. The 97%, which I mentioned, takes into account the land swap, where they will get 3%